They fired the SOS flare because they were dying. 8 seals cornered, in a kill zone, ammo running dry, the jungle closing like a fist. It should have been their last breath. But then 5 impossible shots ripped through the darkness, and the ambush collapsed in seconds. A hidden sniper they had dismissed as dead weight turned hunters into prey. 5 shots, 5 kills, no hesitation. The team stared into the silence, unable to believe what had just saved them. Who was she? Where did she come from? Was she one of them, or something operating far beyond their chain of command? Would you trust a ghost who decides life and death with flawless precision? This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The sea looked deceptively calm when the inflatable boat slid out of the surf and into the channel. Twilight wrapped the coastline of Sabang in rust-red haze, the horizon still holding the last line of light as jungle shadows pressed closer. Lieutenant Gareth Locke crouched at the tiller, one gloved hand steady on the motor's handle, eyes flicking between the cliff face and the tree line. He had navigated countless insertions in his career, yet something in this silence crawled beneath his skin. No birds, no restless monkeys, no chatter of insects, just the whisper of rubber on water and the hiss of salt spray against nylon. It was the kind of quiet that didn't happen naturally. At the bow, Collins gestured with 2 fingers toward a narrow stretch of sand tucked between limestone spurs. 150 meters, looks untouched, his whisper carried like a blade. Locke nodded once, but his jaw tightened. 2 untouched. He didn't like it. Behind him, Morales checked the line of his rifle. Chu adjusted the thermal monocular slung across his chest, and Sanchez resecured a pack that had shifted during the ride. They moved like parts of the same machine, practiced, efficient, almost noiseless. And then there was her, Observer 7, listed in the manifest as Joint Reconnaissance Liaison, had been delivered to them with little explanation beyond the word observer. Mira Cade, pale eyes, regulation uniform, a compact rucksack strapped high between her shoulder blades. She had said almost nothing since the launch point, not even when Locke introduced himself with a firm handshake. Her grip had been steady, her nod precise, and then she had turned, her gaze back to the horizon as though nothing more needed saying. The team had already given her a nickname, the Echo. Locke didn't waste breath on speculation, but even he caught himself wondering why. Someone with no visible firepower had been assigned to shadow a combat patrol. He told himself it didn't matter. Orders were orders. Yet when he glanced back, she sat in the stern with the kind of stillness that didn't match nerves. Stillness like that belonged to people who had trained themselves out of fear. The boat touched shallows. Collins was first into the surf, water climbing to his chest as he steadied the bowline. One by one, boots found sand. Packs rose onto shoulders. Weapons came ready with smooth ritual movements. 2 minutes, and the craft was dragged above the tide line, hull flipped as silent shelter against prying eyes. That was when Morales froze. He had spotted something half buried in the sand. Locke moved closer, kneeling beside it. A jagged steel casing, scorched black, the tail fins snapped off. At first glance it might have been debris from old ordnance, but the way it had been planted upright, perfectly visible, told a different story. A message, a decoy mine, intentionally displayed. Collins muttered under his breath, "Somebody wanted us to see that." Locke's stomach sank. It wasn't just a beach anymore, it was a chessboard. The team fanned out, rifles angled toward the tree line, waiting for gunfire that didn't come. The jungle loomed silent, leaves glinting wet in the fading light. "Sir," Chu whispered, "no heat signatures." He scanned with his monocular, the screen painting the world in grainy outlines. "Looks empty." Locke answered evenly, "Then it's empty until it isn't." Wedge formation 50 meters, Sanchez on point, Chu on rear, Collins left flank, Morales right. "Mira, stay on me." She didn't answer with words, only gave a single sharp nod. They moved. The jungle swallowed them in less than 20 steps. Roots twisted across the path, vines tugged at straps. The air grew heavier with every breath. Sweat beaded beneath helmets as twilight bled into full darkness beneath the canopy. Locke felt his boots sink into damp earth that smelled of rot and flowers. He listened, not to the men, they moved clean, disciplined, but to the forest, or rather, to the absence of it. He had fought in Panama, in Colombia, in half a dozen places where the jungle itself screamed life. Here, it was as if the world held its breath. The trail curled between limestone shelves, natural walls closing them into a narrow throat. Morales hesitated, crouched low. He brushed a patch of earth with his fingertips. The soil crumbled like it had been turned recently. The leaves above it looked arranged, not fallen. Before Locke could speak, Mira's voice slid through the stillness. "Artificial, east to west disturbance, but runoff here runs north. Leaves patterned by hand." Classic setup. Her tone was flat, as if she were delivering a weather report. Locke studied her, catching the precision in her eyes. Not a guess, an assessment. Collins snorted softly. "Since when do desk clerks read soil?" "Since reconnaissance taught me how to," she replied without shifting her gaze. Locke kept his voice measured. "Your assessment? This is designed to funnel you. L-shaped kill zone likely ahead. Whoever prepared it knew what they were doing," Sanchez muttered. "Or she's been watching too many movies." Locke cut him off with a sharp gesture. Eyes forward. "We move!" But inside his gut twisted, because every instinct told him she wasn't wrong. The wedge tightened. They pressed on, each step deeper into terrain that seemed hostile, not because of gunfire, but because of how easy it was. The brush grew thinner, the obstacles fewer. A trail this clean didn't exist in wild jungle. Chu leaned close to Collins. "Notice she moves like she's walked this path before." Collins whispered back, "Notice she's not carrying anything longer than a sidearm." Locke caught the exchange but let it go. Better, they grumbled, than froze. Minutes stretched thin, and the trees suddenly broke open. A clearing lay before them, framed by limestone walls on 3 sides. The ground was smooth, almost sculpted, with just enough space for the squad to stand exposed. The only exit lay through a narrow gap in the far wall. Moonlight spilled through the canopy break above, silvering the stone, casting the scene like a stage. Locke stopped dead. His breath felt too loud. Every briefing, every field manual, every veteran's cautionary tale warned of spaces like this. Too perfect, too convenient. He raised his fist in silent command. The squad froze, rifles aimed outward, and in that moment Locke knew they had walked into the teeth of something waiting. Locke's fist hung in the air, the silent order halting 8 men at the edge of that exposed pocket. The limestone walls gleamed with an unnatural sheen, pale in the fractured moonlight that filtered down like a spotlight. The squad's boots pressed into earth, too clean, too symmetrical, as if someone had swept the jungle aside to create an arena. His instinct screamed retreat, yet orders echoed louder in his skull. Advance, verify, extract. He clenched his jaw, forcing calm into his voice. "We cross," he whispered. The squad obeyed, shoulders tensing beneath their gear. Sanchez stepped first, weapon angled, eyes darting to every ridge. Chu drifted left, Collins right. Morales kept close to Locke's flank. Mira Cade moved just behind, her gaze sweeping the high ground, tracking invisible lines. Halfway across, she murmured so softly it might have been the jungle breathing. "Angles are wrong. Someone prepared firing lanes." Locke's gut knotted. He wanted to halt, to pull back into cover, but hesitation in an exposed bowl could be deadlier than speed. He lifted 2 fingers, signaling forward. The words had barely left his lips when the jungle detonated. Muzzle flashes burst from the ridges. A staccato of disciplined fire. The clearing erupted in sparks and ricochets. Bullets screamed off stone, carving lines of orange light across the darkness. "Contact left! Contact right!" Locke's shout drowned beneath the roar of overlapping weapons. Sanchez dove behind a log too narrow to shield more than his torso. Collins hurled himself toward a shallow depression, soil exploding inches from his helmet. Chu slid behind a jagged slab, stone fragments cutting his cheek. Locke dragged Mira by the shoulder, yanking her behind a jutting outcrop before the air where she'd been filled with fire. Morales cried out, voice breaking as he collapsed. Locke's stomach dropped. A red bloom spread across his thigh, dark against the pale sand. He clutched the wound, teeth bared, still firing short bursts with his free hand. The air stank of cordite and hot limestone. Echoes ricocheted like thunder, bouncing off every wall, distorting direction. Locke pressed his radio to his ear. Static, only static. Either terrain swallowed the signal or the enemy jammed them. Pinned, cut off, his eyes flicked to Mira. He had expected panic, wild eyes, trembling hands. Instead, her breathing stayed even, her posture composed. She studied the ridges, tracing patterns invisible to him. Then she moved. Without waiting for permission, she slipped from cover to Morales' side. Bullets snapped around her, stone splinters slicing her sleeve. She ignored them, tearing open a pouch strapped to her pack. Not a standard kit, Locke realized. A customized trauma set, contents arranged with surgical precision. "Hold still," she ordered Morales, voice steady. Gauze pressed against torn muscle, pressure exact, tourniquet locked with practiced efficiency. Through the tissue, not the artery. "You'll walk if you don't thrash." Morales grimaced, eyes wide. "You? How? Quiet." She cut him off, cinching the bandage. Locke could hardly believe what he saw. This supposed observer worked with the precision of someone who had knelt beside blood before. Someone who had done more than read manuals. Gunfire slackened for a heartbeat, then surged again, tighter, more disciplined. The enemy wasn't spraying, they were coordinating, overlapping arcs to trap the team where they crouched. Collins cursed between bursts. "No clear shots. They've bracketed us. Can't see heads, just flashes." Chu echoed him. "Every exit covered. They want us buried here." Locke's hand brushed his belt. The cold metal cylinder waited there. Last resort. He hated it. But options bled away with every second. He yanked the cap and fired. The flare hissed skyward, streaking orange through the canopy gap. It burst into blazing light above them, painting the clearing in harsh fire. For the first time, Locke saw faces on the ridges, mercenaries with dark scarves across. Their mouths, rifles braced against stone, eyes glinting under the sudden glare. The squad froze at the sight, awed and horrified. The flare screamed desperation, a signal as much to the enemy as to any distant ally. "We're out of options." Gunfire surged harder, emboldened by the admission. Sparks cascaded from rock, tracer rounds slicing inches above helmets. Locke pressed himself flat, lungs burning. Around him, his men fought to stay alive. Beside him, Mira's gaze locked on the ridges. She counted flashes, lips moving without sound. Her hands were steady, movements efficient. 3 shooters on the north, she said at last, calm as briefing notes. 2 more on the east ridge. Heavy gun in that western notch. That's your anchor. Locke stared at her. How in hell can you know? Rate of fire, intervals, chatter, she answered without turning her head. This isn't my first ambush. And then, with a decision that felt premeditated, she unstrapped the hard case from her back. The latch snapped open. Locke's eyes widened. Not notebooks, not radios. A compact rifle emerged, matte black, optics gleaming faintly in the flare's glow. Every surface spoke of customization, every mark of wear spoke of long practice. "You're not authorized," he began. She was already moving, slipping from the outcrop into shadows. Her reply floated back, cool and final. "Neither are they," and then she was gone. The ridges thundered with gunfire, but beneath it came a new sound. Not the harsh chatter of assault rifles, but a precise, suppressed crack that seemed to vanish as soon as it was heard. One muzzle flash on the north ridge winked out. Chu blinked. "What the—" Another shot. The western machine gun sputtered, then fell silent, its voice cut mid-roar. Collins raised his head cautiously, eyes searching. "I don't see her. I don't see anything." Locke's heart hammered. Minutes ago they had been prey in a cage. Now the cage was breaking, and the hand tearing it open belonged to the one person they had dismissed. 5 men huddled in dirt and stone, the flare's dying glow painting their faces. Above them, chaos stirred in the ridges, orders shouted in languages half understood. The disciplined cadence of enemy fire frayed into stuttering bursts. Locke pressed his back against cold limestone, forcing himself to breathe, to wait. Because somewhere out there Miracade was hunting. The flare's glare still burned across the canopy, painting the ridges in. Molten orange when the first suppressed crack echoed through the chaos. It was a sound that didn't belong, sharp, disciplined, vanishing as quickly as it arrived. One of the muzzle flashes on the northern wall blinked out like a star extinguished. For a heartbeat, the squad hesitated, unsure if they had imagined it. Then came the second shot. The heavy gun on the western spur sputtered, coughing half a burst before collapsing into silence. Collins risked a glance over his cover, eyes searching. Nothing but jagged stone and vines swaying in rotor-wash of heat. "I swear I can't see her. I can't see anything moving." Chu's face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat. "Then how the hell is she doing that?" Locke pressed his shoulder harder against the limestone, heart pounding. He hadn't seen her leave, only felt the shadow of her presence slip away into the brush. Now the entire battlefield felt like her hunting ground. The third shot came from an angle no one could place. Another hostile position went silent, its weapon clattering down stone. Shouts erupted in languages Locke only half recognized, panic replacing order. The fire that had been relentless moments before faltered, uneven, uncertain. Sanchez, still pinned behind his log, lifted his head long enough to whisper in disbelief. "It sounds like more than one shooter, like a whole damn team out there." But Locke knew better. His gut told him every bullet was coming from one rifle, one pair of hands. Another report, soft but final, the ridge where radio chatter had been strongest went dark. The voice that had been barking commands a moment ago was cut off mid-word. The mercenaries' discipline unraveled, bursts fired blindly into shadows, tracers carving wild arcs into the sky. They no longer aimed, they reacted. Their certainty, the confidence of hunters cornering prey, was gone. Locke felt the shift like a change in weather. Only minutes earlier, death had pressed down on them from every direction. Now confusion gnawed at the enemy ranks. Mira Cade had turned the board upside down. The fifth shot rang out, cleaner than the rest, as though punctuating the point. Then silence. Real silence. Not the deceptive hush of before, but the absence left when predators scatter. Leaves rustled high on the ridges, footsteps crashed through underbrush, distant voices broke into frantic retreat, swallowed by the jungle. For the first time since entering the clearing, Locke straightened. His ears rang with the sudden quiet, his breath harsh in the void left by gunfire. He scanned the walls, searching for any trace of the shooter who had just dismantled their execution. Nothing. Slowly the others rose from cover. Collins was the first to break the spell. 5 shots, I counted. Just 5, and then nothing. His tone was half awe, half disbelief. Chu shook his head. No one moves that fast. No one shoots that clean. Not alone. Locke looked toward Morales. The young man leaned against stone, bandaged thigh dark but stable. His chest rose and fell with the relief of someone who knew he should be dead but wasn't. And standing over him, calm as if she'd only stepped out for air, was Mira. She emerged from the tree line without ceremony, rifle slung across her chest, boots barely disturbing the soil. The others stared as if a ghost had materialized. She knelt, checked Morales's bandage, adjusted the knot with clinical precision, then rose again, meeting none of their eyes. "Perimeter is clear," she said evenly, voice carrying no triumph, only fact. Collins barked a short laugh, the kind that masked fear. "Clear? You just erased an entire ambush. Who the hell are you?" Mira's gaze didn't waver. "You fired for assistance." "I provided it." "That wasn't assistance," Sanchez said, voice still rough with pain. "That was execution." Mira's only response was a slight shrug, as though precision marksmanship. Under fire were no more unusual than marking coordinates on a map. Locke studied her. Dirt streaked her face, her sleeves torn from splinters, yet her movements were composed, her rifle handled with the ease of long familiarity. He knew weapons. That one had been tuned, customized, used far beyond the life of a standard-issue firearm. Whoever she wasn't new to this. "Where did you get that rifle?" Chu asked, eyes narrowing on the optics mounted atop it. "From people who understood that sometimes standard isn't enough," she replied, matter of fact. Above them the flare finally guttered out, leaving the clearing cloaked again in dim moonlight. For a long moment no one spoke. The team stood in the aftermath of what felt like myth, alive because someone they had written off as irrelevant had revealed herself as something else entirely. Then, faint at first, came the distant thump of rotor blades. Locke tilted his head, recognizing salvation in the sound. Extraction had answered their desperate call faster than expected. The noise grew, chopping the humid air into currents that rattled the canopy. A searchlight swept across the ridge, washing the limestone in sterile white. Mira's eyes flicked toward it. She adjusted the strap on her pack, fingers brushing the rifle at her chest. Locke stepped toward her. "You're coming with us." She shook her head once. "Different pickup, different directive." "What directive?" he pressed. "Who sent you here?" Her expression didn't shift. The kind of mission that doesn't show up on organizational charts. The helicopter's light cut across her face, illuminating features too composed for the carnage she'd just wrought. Then she reached into her pouch and drew out a single brass casing, still warm from the barrel that had changed everything. She placed it in Locke's hand. "Keep it, to remember that sometimes the quietest person is the most dangerous." Before he could answer, she turned and walked back into the jungle, her figure swallowed by shadow, as though the forest itself had claimed her. The helicopter descended, rotor wash scattering leaves, kicking dirt across the clearing. The crew chief jumped down, eyes scanning, voice raised over the thunder. "Casualties?" Locke gestured to Morales, who was conscious, bandaged, and glaring stubbornly at anyone who tried to help him. One wounded, stabilized, thanks to her. The crew chief frowned. "Her?" Locke didn't reply. They loaded Morales first, then the rest climbed aboard. The cabin glowed red under combat lights, faces drawn and weary. As the aircraft lifted, Locke sat with the brass casing still warm in his palm. Collins leaned close, shouting over the roar, "Sir, what are you going to put in the report?" Locke stared out the open side door, the jungle falling away beneath them, endless and dark. Somewhere in that sea of trees, Miracade was already gone, moving toward whatever shadow mission had placed her in their path. "I'll write," he said slowly, "that an unidentified sniper intervened during hostile contact. Details classified." "And if they ask for more?" Collins pressed. Locke closed his fist around the casing, feeling its weight anchor the moment. "Then I'll tell them some things are above our pay grade." The helicopter banked east toward the ocean, rotors hammering the night. Below, the jungle reclaimed its silence, holding its secrets tight. In the red glow of the cabin, Locke looked at his men, alive, bloodied, shaken, but alive. He thought of the decoy mine on the beach, the stage trail, the perfectly sculpted clearing. Someone had engineered this trap with precision, and yet someone else had dismantled it with even greater precision. 5 shots, 5 lives saved. He closed his eyes briefly, not in relief but in acknowledgement. They would leave this place, file their reports, move to the next mission. But the memory of a woman vanishing into the jungle after rewriting the odds would follow them forever. In the end, survival wasn't about firepower or numbers. It was about the one person no one accounted for, the anomaly, the ghost, the echo. And Locke suspected that somewhere in the files locked behind clearance codes none of them would ever see. Miracade had a history written in the same language as those 5 perfect shots. The helicopter's vibration carried through the deck, rattling through boots and bones. Inside the dim red glow of the cabin, the team sat in silence, each man wrapped in his own storm of thoughts. Morales leaned against the bulkhead, jaw set as the medic from the flight crew checked his bandaged leg. His stubborn refusal to show weakness almost collapsed under exhaustion, but he forced himself upright, refusing pity. Locke sat across from him, helmet in his lap, the brass casing clenched in one fist. Its warmth had faded, but the weight remained. It felt heavier than any report, heavier than any medal he had ever worn. Collins finally broke the silence. "Sir? What the hell just happened out there?" His voice was hoarse from shouting over gunfire. Locke didn't answer at once. He studied the shell, turning it over between his fingers, the ridges catching the dim light. The casing was proof and riddle all at once, undeniable yet impossible to explain. Chu leaned forward, eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched into his face. That wasn't an observer. That was someone who's lived behind a rifle longer than any of us. Morales gave a humorless laugh. She moved like the jungle belonged to her. Sanchez shifted, resting his head back against the vibrating wall. She didn't move like anything I've seen. 1 second she's gone, then 5 men are dead and the ridges are quiet. Locke lifted his gaze. "You'll write nothing of it in your logs." Collins frowned. "But command will want to know." "They'll get what they need," Locke interrupted. Contact engaged. We were trapped. Then hostile fire ceased. Extraction arrived. That's it. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They knew better than to push further, but the questions burned behind their eyes. The helicopter banked, pulling them toward the shoreline. Beyond the open side door, the jungle stretched like a dark ocean, endless and impenetrable. Locke stared at it, imagining Mira already gone, disappearing deeper into terrain that devoured footprints. When they touched down at the forward base, the night was nearly spent. The rotors wound down as floodlights lit the landing zone, cutting white beams through humid air. Marines rushed forward to offload the wounded. Morales waved off the stretcher, forcing himself to hobble with one arm slung over Chu's shoulder. Pride weighed heavier than pain. Locke followed them down the ramp, boots hitting the tarmac. His chest tightened at the sudden shift from chaos to order. Sandbags stacked neatly. Vehicles parked in precise rows. Guards standing sharp in their posts. The base felt sterile compared to the wild uncertainty they'd just escaped. But even here, the echo of Mira's shots lingered. Inside the command tent, the air smelled of stale coffee and sweat. Maps littered the table, pins marking routes through jungle terrain. Captain Haldane stood at the head, arms folded, expression a mixture of relief and irritation. "You're late," he snapped. "Report." Locke kept his tone steady. Insertion successful, advanced inland, encountered hostile contact. Ambush was professional, well prepared. Fire support neutralized. Haldane narrowed his eyes. By whom? Locke hesitated. He thought of Mira's face under the flare light, the way she had pressed that casing into his palm. He thought of the precision, the calm, the way she had refused to answer questions. "Unknown sniper," Locke said finally, "appeared during engagement, eliminated hostile positions, identity unconfirmed. Extraction arrived shortly after." The captain studied him for a long moment, suspicion flickering. "Unknown sniper? That's all I can confirm," Locke replied evenly. Haldane exhaled through his nose, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press further without evidence. "Very well. File your debrief. Rest your men. We'll discuss further operations once intelligence reviews your report." Locke saluted, then turned and left the tent. Outside, Collins caught up with him. "Sir, what now?" Locke slipped the casing into his pocket, the weight grounding him. "Now we clean our weapons, we sleep, and we wait for the next set of orders." But he didn't believe the words even as he spoke them, because he knew the next mission wouldn't be the same. Miracade had shifted something fundamental. The squad had glimpsed a capability they weren't supposed to see, and the questions would haunt them long after the bruises faded. Back in the barracks, the men stripped gear in silence. Sanchez dropped onto his bunk, boots still on, eyes staring at the ceiling. Chu meticulously cleaned his rifle, movements sharp, precise, as though order could erase uncertainty. Collins sat with a notebook, pen hovering, then closed it again. He knew he couldn't write what he had witnessed. Morales, pale and sweating, finally broke the quiet. "She saved us. 5 shots, 5 men gone. That's not something you forget," Chu muttered. "Doesn't mean command wants it remembered." Collins looked up. "So what? We just act like she never existed?" Locke entered then, face unreadable. "You'll log what's necessary, nothing more. The rest stays between us." Sanchez pushed himself up on one elbow. "And if they ask?" Locke's eyes swept across them. "Then you tell them what I tell them. Details are classified. If they press harder, it's above our clearance." The room fell silent again, but the unspoken agreement settled over them like a shroud. When the lights dimmed and the base slipped toward uneasy sleep, Locke lay awake. The brass casing rested on the table beside his bunk, gleaming faintly. under the thin beam of moonlight slipping through canvas seams. He replayed the night in his mind, the decoy mine on the beach, the swept trail, the kill box carved into limestone. And then Mira's calm voice, her unerring aim, the way she vanished without looking back. She had not simply saved them, she had revealed herself in the act, then disappeared before questions could pin her down. Locke turned onto his side, staring at the casing. "Who are you, Miracade?" Sleep didn't come. At dawn, when the base stirred again, Locke was already outside, watching the horizon glow gold above the treetops. The jungle stretched endless, silent, holding secrets it would never surrender easily. Somewhere within it, he knew, Mira moved along paths invisible to men like him. The day brought routine, weapons inspections, equipment checks, medical evaluations, yet beneath every order, every standard task, the men felt the shadow of something extraordinary. They had glimpsed skill that defied explanation, and it unsettled them more than the ambush itself. Collins finally voiced what they all thought. She wasn't there by accident. Chu agreed quietly. Nobody that good just observes. Morales, propped on crutches, added, "If she wanted to stay hidden, we never would have known she existed. Maybe saving us wasn't the mission at all. Maybe it was just a side effect." Locke didn't respond. He simply turned the casing in his pocket, thumb tracing the edge. Later, when he sat down to write the official report, his fingers hovered over the keys. He typed, "Engaged hostile force. Team pinned. Rescue flare deployed. Enemy fire ceased. Extraction successful." He stopped there, the blank page mocking him. Every instinct screamed to record what had truly happened, to give credit to the phantom who had shifted the tide. But he erased the thought. Some truths weren't meant for paper. When he closed the file, he slipped the casing back into his pocket. It was the only record that mattered, the only proof he intended to keep. Night fell again over Sabang, and with it came the familiar silence of jungle pressing against the perimeter. But for Locke and his men, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, as though every shadow might hold the figure of a woman, with pale eyes and a rifle that answered desperation with precision. The jungle still clung to them, even back inside the orderliness of the forward base. Each man carried it in his silence, in the way eyes flicked to shadows where none existed. Morning briefings came and went. Captain Haldane handed out assignments in his clipped, uncompromising voice. But Locke could see how little the orders settled with his squad. His men were trained to fight, to adapt, to push forward, but what haunted them wasn't the ambush. It was the woman who had slipped through their lives like a ghost. Collins cleaned his weapon obsessively, more than regulation required. Chu pored over maps, though he already knew the terrain by heart. Sanchez stared at the ceiling of the barracks as if expecting it to collapse. Morales, though wounded, forced himself onto crutches and hobbled the perimeter, unwilling to appear sidelined. All of them avoided one another's eyes when the topic they most wanted to raise hovered between them. Locke broke the silence one evening. "She's gone." The men glanced at him. He didn't look up from the casing he rolled between thumb and forefinger. "Wherever Mira came from, whatever she's part of, it isn't our concern. We keep our heads down." Sanchez scoffed. "You saw her work. That wasn't some fluke. You think Command doesn't know who she is?" Chu shook his head. "If they did, they wouldn't need us out here. They'd send her instead." Collins leaned forward. "Or maybe they did, and we just weren't supposed to notice." The barracks fell quiet again. Locke pocketed the casing and rose. "This conversation ends here." But even he couldn't kill the thought gnawing inside. If she wasn't meant to be seen, why save us at all? The next mission came 2 days later. Routine reconnaissance along another sector of the coastline intelligence, suggesting another supply route hidden under jungle canopy. The squad geared up, the ritual of preparation steadying restless hands. As they moved out, Locke felt eyes on them. Not hostile, not friendly, just watchful. He scanned the tree line, but nothing stirred. The patrol unfolded with an unease none could shake. Every crack of branch, every rustle of leaf reminded them of the ridges and the sudden storm of gunfire. More than once, Locke caught his men glancing upward, as if expecting to see muzzle flashes or hear that silenced rifle again. By afternoon they reached a ridge overlooking the inlet. Chu crouched low, scanning with optics. Tracks, heavy crates hauled inland recently, fresh, within a day. Locke nodded. "Mark it! We'll call it in at extraction," Sanchez muttered. "Feels like bait again." Collins answered, "Everything here feels like bait now." They moved cautiously back toward the pickup point. That was when Morales stumbled, crutch sinking into soil that shifted unnaturally. He swore under his breath. Locke bent down, brushing the ground. The surface was too even, leaves arranged in patterns that didn't match natural fall. He stiffened. Chu hissed, "Trap!" But no explosion came. Instead, tucked under the leaves was something else entirely. A slip of paper, folded neatly, weighted by a single bullet casing. Locke picked it up. The handwriting was sharp, precise, letters pressed into the page without hesitation. "You're being followed. Move fast." His stomach clenched. The men crowded close, reading over his shoulder. Sanchez whispered, "Huh!" Locke's gaze swept the trees, but nothing moved. They doubled pace, senses stretched taut. Every sound carried menace, but no gunfire came, no shapes emerged from the canopy. When they reached the shoreline, the boat was waiting, untouched. Back at base, Haldane listened to Locke's report, eyes narrowing when he saw the paper. "Where did you get this?" Locke answered carefully. "En route back. Planted for us to find. By whom? Unknown." The captain studied him, expression hard. "You're telling me your team stumbled onto a casing and a note in the middle of enemy territory, and you have no idea who left it?" Locke held his gaze. "That's correct, sir." Haldane didn't believe him. Locke could see it in his eyes, but the captain said nothing more. He dismissed them with a curt wave, muttering about intelligence review. That night, the men gathered in the barracks again. The paper lay on the table, the words stark even under dim light. Collins whispered, "She's still out there?" Chu asked. "Then why leave a warning instead of showing herself?" Morales answered grimly, "Because she doesn't want us to see where she is, only what she wants us to know." Locke listened without speaking, the brass casing heavy in his pocket. The paper beside it felt like proof of something he couldn't name, an invisible hand steering them through a maze they didn't understand. When lights went out, he remained awake, staring into darkness. Somewhere in the jungle, Miracade moved unseen, dictating which traps they avoided, which paths they walked. He wondered if saving them in that kill box had been an accident of circumstance, or if it had always been part of her mission. The next day, rumors spread across the base. Another patrol from a different platoon had been ambushed inland. Only 2 survivors limped back, shaken and bloodied, swearing they had heard a suppressed rifle cutting through the chaos before the enemy scattered. No one ever saw the shooter. Locke's men heard the story in silence. Each detail pressed heavier against their unspoken secret. By evening, Collins finally said what they all thought. "She's not done with us." Locke said nothing, but inside, he knew Collins was right. The paper with its neat warning remained folded in Locke's pocket, but the squad carried its weight in every movement. Even during routine drills, they looked to the tree line as though expecting a pale-eyed figure to step out. When night fell, none of them truly slept. The jungle pressed against the perimeter like a tide waiting to reclaim them. 2 days later, orders came down again. Another reconnaissance sweep, deeper inland this time, tracing a rumored supply trail that cut across the ridges. Haldane emphasized stealth, stressed that they were to observe, confirm, and report. Nothing more. Locke heard the words but knew better. Plans drawn at headquarters rarely matched what waited in the bush. They moved out at dawn, mist clinging low across the ground, vines dripping from the canopy above. The squad advanced in silence, every man hyper-aware, ears straining for the unnatural quiet they had come to dread. Morales insisted on joining despite his wound. Pride kept him in line, his crutch traded for a makeshift walking stick. Hours passed with only the scrape of boots and the occasional call of a bird overhead. But the calm felt staged, as if someone had pressed pause on the natural rhythm of the jungle. Sanchez broke formation briefly, crouching beside a scuff in the dirt. Tracks, heavy load, multiple men, headed northeast. Chu examined the ground. Recent, less than a day. They followed cautiously. The path wound into narrowing terrain, the kind of natural corridor that set every nerve on edge. Limestone rose on either side, jagged teeth pressing inward. Collins muttered, "Feels familiar." Locke nodded. Too familiar. He raised a fist to halt the line, studying the stone walls. Patterns in the moss looked disturbed, too evenly scraped. Small chips littered the base of the rock where boots had dislodged them recently. Then came the smell. Gun oil, faint but unmistakable, carried on the humid air. Locke opened his mouth to call retreat. The hillside erupted. Gunfire rained down from hidden nests, the sound slamming into the narrow pass like a physical force. Dirt and leaves exploded around them. The squad scattered, each man diving for whatever cover the terrain grudgingly offered. Morales hit the ground hard, gritting his teeth as pain shot up his leg. "Contact above!" Collins shouted, returning fire upward, though the angle gave him little to work with. Locke slammed against the base of a limestone shelf, forcing his breath steady. They were trapped again, boxed in by elevation and firepower. Sanchez yelled over the chaos, "They waited for us!" Chu snarled, "They've studied our routes. They knew we'd be here." Locke's radio spat nothing but static. The enemy had learned, jamming again. He reached for his flare instinctively, but stopped. The last time he had lit the sky, salvation hadn't come from headquarters. It had come from her. Now he found himself listening, straining for a sound he had never thought he'd count on, the subdued snap of that suppressed rifle. At first there was only the roar of enemy guns. Then, cutting clean through, came that distinct crack. One of the ridges faltered, muzzle flashes sputtering out. Another shot followed, precise, controlled. A second nest, silenced. Collins swore under his breath. "She's here!" Chu answered. "Of course she is. We were bait again." Locke didn't argue. His chest tightened as he realized how much they had come to rely on someone who wasn't even part of their unit. Above, panic spread among the mercenaries. Their fire grew erratic, orders shouted with less confidence. They had walked in certain they controlled the ground, only to find themselves dismantled by an unseen predator. Locke risked a glance upward. Nothing. No movement, no silhouette. Just the jungle swallowing its own secrets. Sanchez pressed his back against the rock, breathing hard. "She's not even with us, and she's leading this fight." Mira's rifle cracked again. Another muzzle went dark. The enemy broke. Shouts echoed in retreat, footsteps crashing through brush as fighters scrambled away from the invisible hand tearing them apart. Silence followed, thick and absolute. The squad remained pressed against stone, hardly daring to believe it. Finally, Collins whispered, "That's twice now," Morales added bitterly, "and twice she saved us before command ever lifted a finger." Locke forced himself upright, scanning the ridge with his weapon raised. Nothing but drifting smoke and disturbed foliage. Then, at the edge of the clearing, a branch swayed against the still air. A shape emerged for only an instant. A figure watching from the shadows. Pale eyes caught the light, then vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Locke's throat tightened. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, staring into the space where she had been. Sanchez followed his gaze. "You saw her." Locke nodded once. When they finally withdrew to the extraction point, the jungle seemed to press closer, as though reminding them they weren't in control. The boat carried them back to base, each man locked in his own turmoil. They had survived again, but survival no longer felt like their own achievement. Back in the barracks, Chu sat on his bunk, running a cloth over his rifle, though it didn't need cleaning. "We can't keep pretending she's just coincidence. She's steering us." Collins leaned forward. "And if she is, maybe that's the only reason we're still breathing." Sanchez shot back. "Or maybe she's just using us. What if we're the distraction? What if we're cover for whatever her real mission is?" Morales slammed his crutch against the floor. "I don't care what she's doing. Twice I should have been dead. Twice I'm still here because of her. That's enough." The room fell into uneasy silence. Locke sat apart, casing still in his pocket, the folded paper beside it. Both tokens burned heavier than any metal. He thought of her eyes under the flare, the calm certainty in her voice, the precision of her shots, and he wondered whether they were pawns in someone else's game or beneficiaries of a protector who chose them for reasons he could not fathom. That night, as the base settled under the hum of generators and the distant crash of surf, Locke stood alone outside. The jungle stretched endless beyond the perimeter wire. He could almost feel her presence out there, moving unseen, watching from cover no map could mark. He whispered into the darkness, "Who are you, Mira?" No answer came, only the rustle of leaves in the humid wind, but Locke knew this. She hadn't finished, and neither had the question she left in her wake. The following morning broke grey and heavy, clouds rolling inland with the promise of rain. At the forward base, the squad moved through their routines with an unease that discipline couldn't mask. Every weapon inspection, every field check, every quiet glance carried the weight of something unspoken twice. They had walked into traps, and twice an unseen marksman had dismantled those traps with surgical precision. Word of the ambush had already spread across the camp. Other units whispered about a phantom shooter covering Locke's men. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others spoke of it with a kind of reverence, as if the jungle itself had decided to side with them. Captain Haldane called Locke into the command tent before noon. The canvas flaps snapped in the damp wind, and the air inside smelled of ink, wet maps, and tension. "2 ambushes in less than a week," Haldane said, leaning over the table. "Your team walks out without losses. Meanwhile, Bravo Squad gets chewed to pieces. You want to explain that?" Locke stood at parade rest, expression neutral. "We adapted. Luck was on our side." Haldane's eyes narrowed. "Luck doesn't pick sides twice. You're leaving something out." Locke chose his words carefully. "Hostile forces broke under pressure. Poor coordination. We exploited it." The captain slammed a fist on the table, rattling compasses. "Don't insult me! Someone out there is playing this game better than both sides." If it's friendly, I want to know who. If it's not, I need to know why you're still alive. Locke didn't flinch. With respect, sir, my team did what we were trained to do. Survive. The captain studied him for a long, silent beat. Then he leaned back, the suspicion in his gaze sharpening. File your report. I'll be sending it further up. Don't leave anything out, Lieutenant. If you can't give me names, I'll find someone who can. Locke saluted, then stepped outside into the thick air. The men waited near the barracks, eyes tracking him as he approached. Collins was the first to speak. He's pressing you, isn't he? Locke nodded once. He suspects. Chu muttered, Of course he does. 2 miracles in a row looks less like fortune and more like someone pulling strings. Sanchez spat into the dirt. Let him suspect. Without her, we'd be bones in that clearing. Morales, leaning on his stick, said quietly, But what if Haldane decides we're liabilities? What if Command thinks we've seen too much? The words hung heavy. Locke didn't answer, but in his gut, he felt the truth in them. That evening, rain finally broke, hammering the tin roofs in relentless sheets. The squad sat together, listening to the storm. No one spoke of Mira directly, but the silence was full of her. Then Collins pulled something from his pocket, a small scrap of cloth, damp and stained. Found this near the ridge after the last fight, he said. He laid it on the table. Embroidered in one corner was a faded emblem, a hawk's talon clutching lightning. Chu's eyes widened. That's not ours. That's... He stopped, unwilling to say more. Locke picked up the cloth, fingers brushing the stitching. He had seen the symbol once before, years ago, in a briefing about units that didn't officially exist. Groups that operated outside standard chains of command, ghosts who carried out tasks no one wanted to admit. He tucked the cloth away. We don't discuss this again, but the men had already drawn their own conclusions. The following day brought no missions, only the monotony of waiting, yet tension stretched tighter. Other squads eyed them strangely. Whispers followed them to the mess hall. Some soldiers looked at them with envy, others with suspicion. That night, as Locke stepped outside for air, he felt the weight of unseen eyes again. He scanned the rain-slick tree line. A flicker of movement caught his attention, brief, deliberate. He knew she was out there watching. Why us? He whispered into the dark. The jungle gave no answer. 2 nights later, everything broke open again. An alarm jolted the camp awake, sirens wailing, boots pounding mud. Enemy mortars screamed from the hills, explosions throwing plumes of dirt into the air. The base shuddered under the bombardment. Locke yanked on gear and rallied his men. Floodlights lit the compound in harsh white. Soldiers sprinted for defensive positions, shouting over the chaos. Through the haze of smoke and rain, Locke saw movement on the ridges. Figures slipped between trees, shadows with rifles. The base was under full assault. Haldane barked orders, his voice hoarse. Hold the perimeter! Repel them! Locke and his squad took position behind sandbags. Weapons braced. Fire erupted, tracers cutting through the rain. Morales, bracing on one leg, fired steady bursts Chu called targets. Collins answered with precision shots. Sanchez kept the flank secure. Still, the attackers pressed, disciplined and relentless. Mortars gave way to small arms fire. The base trembled under the weight of their push. Then, amid the chaos, Locke heard it. A suppressed crack, unmistakable, threading through the storm. One of the enemy snipers collapsed, sliding down the ridge. Another shot followed, dropping a mortar team before they could reload. The squad didn't need to speak. They knew. Mira was here. Panic rippled through the enemy line. Shadows faltered, momentum broken by invisible strikes. Within minutes, their coordinated assault fractured into retreat. Boots pounded back into the jungle, shouts fading beneath the storm. The sirens wound down. The base stood battered but intact. Soldiers leaned against walls, breathing hard, disbelief etched across faces. Locke looked toward the ridge. No one stood there, but the truth was undeniable. Collins wiped rain from his face. "She saved the whole camp," Chu added, "and nobody will admit it." Haldane stormed across the mud, furious and bewildered. "Report!" he demanded. "Who fired those shots?" Locke kept his voice even. "Unconfirmed. Could have been a scout team covering us. Hard to say in the rain." The captain glared at him, unconvinced, but the chaos of post-battle demanded his attention elsewhere. He stalked off, shouting for casualty reports. The squad exchanged looks in the downpour. None of them spoke her name, but the knowledge bound them tighter than any oath. That night, Locke sat alone in the barracks, the brass casing in one hand, the scrap of cloth in the other. Evidence of a ghost who didn't exist. Proof of someone who changed battles without ever stepping into the light. He closed his fist around them. Mira Cade was more than a shadow. She was altering the course of their war. And Locke knew it wouldn't stop here. The storm that had shielded the battle finally thinned by morning. Steam rose from the soaked ground, curling around sandbags and vehicles. The base looked like a scar. Craters punched into the earth, walls blackened, the air still heavy with the stink of explosives. Soldiers moved slowly through the wreckage, exhausted but alive. Locke's men gathered near the barracks. Mud streaked across their uniforms, eyes red from a night without sleep. None of them had spoken Mira's name, but each carried her presence in the silence between them. They had no doubt who had turned the assault into a retreat. Captain Haldane moved like a man hunting ghosts. He interrogated watchposts, questioned every squad leader, demanded answers from anyone who might have fired a rifle. No one admitted to the impossible precision that had cut the enemy apart. The mystery only deepened his fury. When Locke filed his account, Haldane's stare burned into him. "You're protecting someone," the captain said flatly. Locke kept his gaze steady. "We engaged as ordered. Hostiles withdrew under pressure. That's all I can verify." "You're lying," Haldane snapped. "Then prove it," Locke answered quietly. For a long moment, the two men held each other's stare. Finally, Haldane dismissed him with a curt gesture, but Locke knew the suspicion would not fade. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Locke walked the perimeter alone. The jungle stretched endless and inscrutable, cicadas beginning their chorus, leaves dripping from the storm's residue. He stopped at a break in the wire, staring into the trees. "You're still out there," he murmured. A flicker of motion answered him. Mira Cade stepped from the shadows with the same quiet inevitability as dawn. She wore the same unmarked gear, rifle slung casually across her chest, expression calm. "You shouldn't be here," Locke said. "Neither should you," she replied. He let out a bitter laugh. "You saved this camp last night. Do you plan on saving it again tomorrow? Or is this where you vanish for good?" Mira's pale eyes met his. "My extraction is arranged. Different point, different schedule. I don't stay." "Why us?" Locke pressed. "Why warn us? Why intervene twice?" Her face didn't change. "Because you were useful. Because keeping you alive served the larger objective." Collins stepped out of the barracks behind Locke, having followed quietly. "We're pawns, then?" he asked. Mira's gaze shifted to him. "Pieces on the board. But sometimes pawns change the game." Locke felt anger stir. "If we're pieces, who's playing?" She looked back toward the jungle. "Not people you'll ever meet. Not people who put their names on paperwork." Morales hobbled forward, leaning on his stick. "That's not good enough. You saved me. Twice. If we're just collateral, why bother?" Mira regarded him for a long moment. For the first time, a faint flicker of something almost human crossed her face. Because sometimes the line between objective and conscience is thinner than people admit. You were in my path. That was enough. Rain began again, light this time, misting across their faces. Locke stepped closer. Come with us! If Command knew what you could do. Her interruption was sharp. If Command knew you'd never see me again, not alive. Some skills stay in the shadows because daylight would burn them away. She reached into her pouch and pulled free another casing, this one etched with faint markings scratched by hand. She pressed it into Locke's palm. This is my last message. Don't follow, don't ask. Colin shook his head. That's not an answer. It's all you'll get, Mira said simply. Then she turned, melting back into the jungle as if the forest itself had swallowed her. The squad stood in stunned silence. Back inside, they argued. Sanchez slammed his fist against the table. She used us. She admitted it. Chu countered. And yet without her, we're dead. That counts for something. Morales looked down at his bandaged leg. She didn't have to save me, but she did. Call it objective or call it mercy. I'm still here. Collins paced, frustration radiating from him. We don't even know what side she's on. Locke sat apart, the casing in his hand once again. Unlike the first, this one bore deliberate scratches, an emblem, half-finished lines forming what looked like coordinates. He stared at it, realizing it wasn't just a token. It was direction. He tucked it away. We hold this close, no one else sees it. The men fell silent, understanding his meaning. That night, helicopters ferried reinforcements into the battered base. Command wanted answers, but none came. Mira's existence remained nothing more than rumor. Official reports mentioned only unknown supporting fire, nothing more, but Locke knew better. And as he lay awake, listening to the thrum of generators and the restless jungle beyond, he understood that Mira had not left them with closure. She had left them with a burden, proof that the war they thought they were fighting was only part of a larger design. When dawn came, the squad prepared for new orders. Each man moved with the discipline drilled into them, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were no longer fighting only enemies they could see. They were navigating the shadow of someone far more dangerous, and she had chosen to walk alone. Locke tightened the strap on his gear and slipped the casing into his pocket beside the first one. The metal felt heavy, etched with questions he couldn't answer. Somewhere in the jungle, Mira Cade was already gone, but her mark lingered. Not just in the ridges cleared of ambushes or the camp saved from destruction, but in the men she had left behind, soldiers who would never see war the same way again. The days after Mira's departure unfolded with a strangeness the squad couldn't shake. The jungle still pressed against the wire, the missions kept coming, the orders never ceased, but nothing felt the same. It was as if they were moving through two wars at once, the one written in briefings and maps, and the other that lived in shadows, shaped by a figure who no longer walked beside them. Locke carried the second casing everywhere. At night, when the base quieted and the jungle hummed, he would take it from his pocket, turn it in his hand, trace the faint scratches etched into the brass. Coordinates, maybe. A warning, maybe, or perhaps just her way of ensuring he never forgot. He tried not to dwell on it, but the truth gnawed at him. Mira Cade had left them alive not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And she hadn't vanished empty-handed. She had left him with proof that her mission, whatever it was, still intersected with theirs. The squad noticed the change in him. Collins would catch him staring off into the tree line, lost in thought. Chu saw how often his fingers brushed his pocket, as if checking that the casing hadn't disappeared. Sanchez muttered that Locke had started listening for sounds no one else could hear. Even Morales, who owed his leg and his life to Mira, began to wonder aloud if their lieutenant was chasing a ghost. One evening after a long patrol, they sat around the dim light of a lantern in the barracks. Rain ticked against the canvas. Sanchez leaned forward, voice low. "She's not done with us. You know it, sir. We all feel it." Locke didn't deny it. He simply turned the casing in his palm and said, "Then be ready when the time comes. Because if she reaches for us again, it won't be to make us comfortable. It'll be because she needs us to play our part." Silence followed, heavy with acknowledgement. None of them argued. The following morning, Captain Haldane summoned Locke. The command tent buzzed with tension. Reports from intelligence covered the table, pins clustered across the map like wounds. Haldane's eyes were hard as stone. "You've had unusual luck, Lieutenant," he said. "Luck command doesn't trust." Locke stood still, waiting. Haldane tapped a folder. "We're pulling your squad out. Extraction scheduled for tomorrow. You'll debrief in Manila before reassignment. Higher wants answers about these interventions. If you're holding anything back, you'll answer for it there." Locke's jaw tightened, but he gave no protest. "Understood." Dismissed, he returned to his men with the news. Relief mingled with unease. They were going home, but none of them believed they were leaving the real war behind. That night, Locke sat awake again, casing on the table before him. He leaned closer to the lantern, examining the etchings. The more he studied, the more convinced he became. It wasn't random. The pattern resembled grid marks he had seen on reconnaissance charts, not exact, but close enough to suggest a location, coordinates. A choice burned before him: ignore it, follow orders, leave tomorrow, and bury the memory, or admit that Mira had left them a trail for a reason. The decision tore at him until dawn. When the sun bled across the jungle canopy, Locke gathered the squad. "We're wheels up tonight. But before we leave, we follow one last lead." Sanchez frowned. "Orders? Not from command," Locke admitted. "From her." Chu's eyes narrowed. "Coordinates?" Locke held up the casing. "She wanted us to see this. I'm not leaving until we find out why." Collins grinned despite the tension. "About time we stopped pretending." They moved out at first light, leaving no word behind. The jungle swallowed them quickly, wet earth sucking at their boots. The coordinates led them inland, deeper than they had ventured before. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant call of birds. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. At its base lay a small encampment hidden under netting and foliage, crates stacked in rows, antennas jutting upward, men in mismatched uniforms moving with the precision of trained soldiers. Chu hissed, "That's no bandit camp, that's organized." Collins lifted his scope, studying the markings on the crates. His breath caught surface-to-air missiles, enough to swat helicopters from the sky. Sanchez swore softly, "So that's what she wanted us to see." Locke's pulse hammered. Mira hadn't left them riddles for amusement. She had guided them to the heart of the threat. The squad recorded everything: photographs, counts, routes. They marked coordinates carefully, ensuring proof for command. But even as they worked, Locke sensed they weren't alone. He scanned the tree line. There, across the valley, half hidden behind foliage, he saw the glint of optics. Pale eyes behind the glass, watching, waiting. Mira. She didn't move. She didn't signal. She simply observed as they gathered evidence, and when Locke blinked, she was gone again. The squad withdrew without incident, returning to the base by dusk. They filed their report, presenting the intelligence as if they had stumbled upon it by chance. Haldane studied them with suspicion, but the evidence was undeniable. Within hours, higher command authorized airstrikes on the valley. That night, the jungle lit with thunder. Explosions rolled across the ridges, fire blooming against the horizon. The hidden camp, the missiles, the threat, erased. The squad watched from the perimeter, flames painting their faces. Colin shook his head. "She handed us that on a platter," Chu muttered, "and no one will ever know." Locke stared into the inferno. "We'll know. That's enough." The next day, helicopters arrived for extraction. The base bustled with activity as men packed gear and prepared to rotate. Locke's squad moved with the rest, but every step felt weighted. They weren't just leaving a battlefield. They were leaving behind the shadow of the one who had changed everything. As the rotors thundered overhead, Locke paused before boarding. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the 2 casings, and held them for a moment in his palm. Symbols of encounters no report would ever capture. Tokens of a woman who lived between silence and violence. He slipped them back into his pocket and climbed aboard. Inside the helicopter, the squad strapped in. The cargo bay glowed red, familiar and haunting. Sanchez leaned close, shouting over the roar. "What do we tell them in Manila?" Locke met his gaze. "We tell them we did our jobs. We tell them we survived. Everything else stays with us." Chu smirked. "So we're carrying a ghost story home." Collins added, "The kind nobody will believe." Morales, eyes heavy but steady, whispered, "We'll believe it. That's enough." The helicopter lifted, rising above the jungle. The canopy stretched endless below, green waves hiding secrets that would never be written down. Somewhere within it, Mira Cade walked alone, continuing a mission without name or record. Locke closed his eyes, the roar of the rotors blending with memory. He saw the flare bursting above the clearing, the impossible silence after her 5 shots, the ridges falling quiet one by one. He remembered her words, "Sometimes the quietest person is the most dangerous." When the helicopter banked toward the sea, the squad sat in silence, each man holding his own memory of her. She had been more than a savior, more than a sniper. She had been proof that war was fought not just by those in the reports, but by figures who slipped through the cracks, rewriting battles and vanishing without thanks. And for Locke, the casings in his pocket were more than souvenirs. They were reminders. Precision mattered more than rank. Competence outweighed titles. And sometimes, the difference between life and death came from the hand of someone you were never meant to notice. The jungle shrank into distance, but her presence lingered. She had become more than a soldier, more than a myth. She was the echo of survival, the shadow that tilted the fight when all seemed lost. The squad would never speak her name again in official halls, but in their hearts Mira Cade would remain, as indelible as the scars on their bodies and the fire in their memories. 5 shots, 2 casings, a legend none of them would forget. When the helicopter carried Locke and his men away from the jungle, the war they left behind was not the same war they had entered. They carried more than scars and more than exhaustion. They carried a story that would never appear in official reports. Think about that. Soldiers train their whole lives for combat. They prepare for fire, for blood, for chaos, but nothing in their manuals prepared them for the silence of 5 perfect shots. Nothing in their training accounted for the woman who appeared without invitation and rewrote the outcome of their battle. Mira Cade was not part of their mission brief. She wasn't on the chain of command. She didn't wear the insignia they trusted. But in the deadliest moments, when the squad was seconds from being erased, she chose to intervene. And by doing so, she changed the course of lives. Not just their own, but perhaps the balance of the conflict itself. And here's what matters most. She asked for nothing in return. She didn't claim their gratitude. She didn't step into the light to take credit. She walked away, leaving only brass and silence behind. That's the paradox of war. Sometimes the names written in history are not the ones who saved the day. Sometimes the heroes vanish before anyone can thank them. The world will never know their true contribution, but the people who survived will never forget. Locke and his men survived 2 ambushes they should not have survived. They watched a base withstand an assault it should not have endured, and at every turning point the deciding factor was not superior numbers, not heavier firepower, not even luck. It was one unseen sniper, moving like the jungle itself, choosing where to draw the line between life and death. Think about how that changes a soldier. They went into the field believing their training was enough. They came out understanding that survival sometimes belongs to forces beyond their command. They learned humility in the shadow of a woman who fought with no recognition, no documentation, no promise of rescue. That's what legends are made of. Not medals, not headlines. Moments that defy explanation. Moments that live only in the memories of those who were there. And now the question turns to you. What do you believe? Do you think Miracade was real, flesh and blood, operating under orders we'll never see? Or do you think she was something else entirely, a phantom, a myth born from desperation and fear? Could any one person move that quickly, shoot that precisely, and vanish that completely? The men who lived owe their lives to her, that much is undeniable. But the rest? The truth will stay locked in shadows. Here's another question. What would you do with the weight of that knowledge? Imagine holding 2 casings in your hand, tokens of a savior no one else believes in. Would you speak, even if no one believed you? Or would you carry the silence, knowing that silence was the very way she had chosen to live? Locke chose silence. He wrote reports that left her name unwritten. He saluted his captain, told the story expected of him, and buried the rest. But in his pocket, those casings remained. Evidence, proof, a reminder that when everything failed, it wasn't command or doctrine that saved them. It was the person they had dismissed as irrelevant. Maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never dismiss the person in the corner, the one overlooked, the one written off. Sometimes they're the ones carrying the power to alter everything. And that lesson isn't confined to war. It belongs everywhere, in our workplaces, in our families, in our communities. The ones we ignore may be the very ones who change our lives when it matters most. For Locke's squad, Miracade became more than a sniper. She became the embodiment of that truth. They will never know her real mission. They will never know her unit, her origin, or her fate. But they will always know this: 5 shots, 5 lives saved, no mistakes, and in the end, that was enough. Now the story is yours. You've heard what they carried out of that jungle, the memory of a ghost who may never be spoken of again. What you do with it is up to you. So let me ask you directly, what would have gone through your mind, crouched in that clearing, knowing you were seconds from death, and then hearing a single suppressed shot turn the battle upside down? Would you trust that ghost? Would you follow her if she asked? I want to know what you believe. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. How many people out there still believe in the possibility of a legend walking in silence? Because legends don't just live in books. They live in moments. They live in echoes. And sometimes they live in casings small enough to fit in a pocket, but heavy enough to change a life. This has been VeteranBiker. If this story spoke to you, if it made you think, if it made you question the way history is written, then I'm asking you, subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to. Be reminded that the quietest voice can sometimes be the strongest. We'll keep bringing you stories like this, stories that remind you That courage isn't always loud, and heroes aren't always visible. Stay with us, watch the next video waiting on your screen now, and remember, sometimes salvation comes from the person no one ever sees coming. Thank you for watching. This is VeteranBiker. Until next time, ride safe, stand strong, and never forget the power of the unseen.